Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Abuse, brutality, bias. Long-standing charges against Newark Police. But there's new muscle in the calls for reform.
United will never be divided.
A scathing federal report confirming the claims. A new activist mayor demanding new accountability and controls. Denied for half a century. A civilian police review board now on tap for Newark, if it can survive a legal challenge. That's next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation.
Activists have been demanding it for nearly 50 years, insisting that police brutality and misconduct have never stopped being a problem in Newark. But their calls for a civilian police review board have fallen on deaf ears until one of those activists became Newark's mayor. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and on this edition of Due Process, civilian review of Newark Police, proposed by the mayor, backed by a range of community and legal advocates, opposed by some police who say it's not legal. We'll hear from all sides here in the studio, but first, a look from the streets and the archives to frame the passion that surrounds this issue. It didn't start in '67, though the civil unrest that left 26 dead was triggered by the beating and rumored killing by white police of a black cabbie in a traffic stop.
The immediate problem was, of course, the cab driver that was beaten by the policeman. But what caused the riot was what caused the riot all over America.
And it didn't end with the election of Newark's first black mayor, or nearly 50 years of black political rule.
This is our destiny. This is Newark.
Since African Americans first called this home, since the Great Migration brought blacks to Newark in large numbers, racial bias, brutality, humiliation by police has been fact.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
And since the 60s, there have been calls for a civilian board to deal with a range of complaints against Newark cops.
Newark is unique in many ways, but it's also connected to a larger issue, like I said, of anti-black state violence.
They just snatched me out of my car, searched me.
Too many people have become victims of police misconduct and abuse in this city for far too long. The time for change is now.
And since the 60s, there have been calls for a civilian board to deal with a range of complaints against Newark cops.
These people are not going to change just because we ask them to change.
For generations, those calls were largely ignored.
Watch out, America, here comes Newark.
Then Newark elected this man, son of activist poet Amiri Baraka.
I thought all we had to do was get rid of those white folks, and we would live happily ever after.
Among the longest and loudest Newark voices against police abuse.
I got my head split open, my teeth knocked out.
My father was in the Newark Rebellion in 1967. He was hit over the head.
And Amiri's son still carries the banner.
It is the irony of history.
Now from inside City Hall.
The reality is I marched a lot outside of City Hall, myself calling for civilian police review boards.
That at the same time, the ACLU was documenting cases of police misconduct.
I was just a black kid in Newark who got arrested for talking back.
Talking back when an officer ordered the 16-year-old, an honors student, to stop recording police actions on a bus.
And that upset me a lot.
The ACLU won her a settlement.
But what's important to remember, this is emblematic of a real pattern and practice by the Newark Police Department.
A pattern the Justice Department also found in a 3-year federal probe.
The Newark Police Department, an organization that is challenged in fundamental ways and has engaged in a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing in a broad range of areas.
A pattern of unjustified arrests and unwarranted force with disproportionate racial impact.
The burden of this practice of stopping people without sufficient reason has fallen most heavily on black people.
So a federal monitor will be named to oversee and reform police practice.
Power to the people. Power to the people. No justice.
But the ACLU, its community partners, and Newark's mayor all contend that's good.
It's important for them to have faith in the police department, and right now that's lacking.
But not enough. Citizen oversight, they say, is essential.
Because bad behavior in this department has gone unchecked, and misguided practices and policies have intensified the divide between the community and the department.
The Justice Department found that 75% of stop and frisks in Newark have no constitutional basis, found widespread excessive force, found a police department that retaliates against Newarkers for engaging in First Amendment protected speech, and the Justice Department found an internal affairs system that's broken.
Mike Brown! Mike Brown!
And the pushback in Newark plays out against the national outrage in response to the deaths by police of unarmed black men, like Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in Staten Island.
This is not a Newark problem. It's not a Detroit problem. It's not an LA problem. This is a national problem, and it needs to be fully addressed by our national leadership, starting with the president.
Let's remember that we're all part of one American family. We are united in common values, and that includes belief in equality under the law, a basic respect for public order, and the right to peaceful public protest.
And even the director of the FBI acknowledges what he calls hard truths about policing and race.
We can roll up our car windows, turn up the radio, and drive around these problems. Or we can choose instead to have an open and honest discussion about what our relationship is today.
And what to do to make it better.
Fill the streets! Fill the streets! Fill the streets! Fill the streets! Justice for Michael Brown! Justice for Michael Brown! Justice for Eric Garner! Justice for Eric Garner! Meaningful reform would be when we see a significant decline in cases of police brutality, use of excessive force, abuse of authority. When we see significant declines, then we know we're on the right track.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
An overstatement of the problem or a clear-headed look at generations of abuse? Will civilian oversight make more than a cosmetic difference? And is it legal? For some very different answers, we turn to Newark's Mayor Ras Baraka, to Captain John Chrystal, president of the Newark Police Superior Officers Association, and to Ari Rosmarin, Public Policy Director for the ACLU of New Jersey. Welcome, all of you. Mayor, if we go back to those early pictures that we just saw of your dad in the 60s calling for this very same solution, since then there have been 2 generations of black political leadership in the city of Newark, as well as a demographic change in the department to being majority black and Latino.
Right.
Why do we still need a civilian complaint review board?
Well, I think some of the things that exist are systemic and they're patterns and practices. And obviously, I think that there are police officers who come to work every day and don't participate in any of the things that we're talking about, who come to do a good job. But I don't think the organization is designed in such a way to police itself in the way it needs to be done. And so it's necessary for us to have an outside body be able to look over some of the things that are happening in the police department, not just incidents, but the kind of systemic practices that take place.
Is it a problem, Captain, as the FBI director suggested, of police culture, irrespective of race, that makes assumptions that turn out to be racist assumptions, and therefore you get a disparate impact on blacks, therefore you get a disregard of constitutional requirements? Is any of that fair? Because it's what's being suggested at virtually every level.
Well, I know the FBI, they released a report, Department of Justice, and they're going to have a federal monitor here. But
here in Newark.
Yes, but I don't know if we get the whole picture here, because they said that it's a disparate treatment. However, let's look at the crime statistics. Who were the victims of the crimes? Who are the suspects of the crimes? Who were the victims telling the police who their suspects were? And the suspects being stopped in that area.
So when the U.S. Attorney says the burden of police misconduct in Newark is falling on blacks, you say that's not fair?
Well, I have to review everything what he's saying, but you have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Let me just take race out of it. Let's assume that we'd had racial harmony for 400 years and that wasn't an issue. Still, there would be constitutional questions. If the federal government says you have unconstitutional stops and unconstitutional arrests and no real examination or discipline of those who use excessive force, isn't that an issue that ought to invite civilian participation and oversight?
Well, there has to be public trust with the police department. There has to be honesty, integrity, truthfulness. And anytime like somebody is arrested, at least you have procedural due process rights. You have the right to go to court, the right to have a trial. But we do have oversight of the police department. It's called the Internal Affairs Division, and the county prosecutor oversees the internal affairs process. And also, it's mandated by state statute 4814-181 that the department, that all municipal police departments, all law enforcement agencies in the state of New Jersey have internal affairs policies that are consistent with the New Jersey Attorney General's policies on internal affairs.
And yet the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney have said there is a problem in internal affairs. And one of the most glaring places, I think, is out of hundreds of complaints of excessive force. How many in the years they looked at were?
Out of hundreds of excessive force complaints, they substantiated one. So I think I appreciate the captain identifying internal affairs as a source of oversight, but the jury's in. The record is clear. Internal affairs in the Newark Police Department has fell down on the job, and that's validated by the Department of Justice report. But also, I want to pick up on what the captain said, because trust and cooperation with the community, I think all of us will agree, is a critical step to having a successful police department. The mayor talks a lot about that in building trust. And when community members feel like they're not getting a fair shake, and when their rights are violated and there's nowhere to go, and there's no direction to vindicate those rights and be heard, you lose trust, you lose cooperation, and the cornerstones of community policing erode. And so what we know is that, right, part of it, there's a racial disparity in stops, in arrests, in frisks, and searches. But importantly, as you pointed out, Ray, if those stops were turning up good police work and we're making arrests out of that, that would be one thing. But as the DOJ made clear, up to 75% of stops lacked a constitutional basis. So the problem really runs through.
Mayor, let me ask you a question about real politics. You're responsible for everybody in the community.
Yeah.
And we say community, there are community people who are focused on victimization and being victims of crime, as the captain mentioned, and others who are focused on the issue of constitutional policing, and some people who care about both. Realistically, can you steer the idea of a civilian complaint review board through the waters of whatever litigation may follow, opposition from some police officers, a community that concerns about dynamic tensions, and come out with something that has real teeth and real civilian involvement? It seems to me, as a political naive person, this is quite a challenge.
Oh, absolutely. I think most of the things we do are challenging, though. We didn't take the job because it was easy. But I think that we can make it happen. I think there are enough rational people at the table who are understanding what needs to happen. It's obvious that residents need to have the opportunity to feel like they can get their complaints heard outside of a body that's not connected to the police department, that they should feel free enough to say, I want to, and have the choice to say, I want to go to this organization and not this one to have my complaints heard, so they can have a sense of trust in government and police, period, that their complaints are actually are not going to fall on deaf ears. That's number one. So you have to create that opportunity. And it's not just for civilians, it's also for police officers to be able to make complaints as well. And I think there are folks in the police department who feel like that they, even the justice that they receive in the police department is arbitrary and not consistent. So I think that we have to create an opportunity for police officers themselves to actually have an opportunity to redress some of the things that are happening in the department to them as individuals and policy-wise. And I think the board, an individual or independent board, seeks to do that.
Captain Chrystal, you have raised the specter of illegality in the way that this Civilian Police Review Board is being proposed. Do you expect that your union is going to actually file an action to stop it?
Well, just like make it clear, we're not against having a Civilian Complaint Review Board, provided that it's within the confines of the law.
And what's wrong with this one, as the
Well,
mayor
I
proposed it?
haven't seen the final draft of
No,
it.
but you've seen the early drafts. What don't you like?
Well, what
are you telling the mayor don't put in?
Well, under the Civilian Complaint Review Board, under state mandates, it says that you're supposed to have an internal affairs policy. All law enforcement agencies under 4814-181 are supposed to adopt internal affairs policies.
And that would remain under the mayor's order.
But that it's supposed to be investigated, all criminal matters and administrative matters. Yes, are supposed to be investigated by law enforcement personnel under the internal affairs policy. And the law also says that it cannot be inconsistent with civil service statutes or collective agreements. Now, this is basically a pre-disciplinary matter. Now, these are terms and conditions of employment that have to be negotiated. Now, I don't know if the mayor is aware, but we have a consent order in place going back to 2008, judge rulings going back to 1998 that says they have to follow, the city has to follow our disciplinary process. Now, these are all mandatory topics of negotiation. We have certain procedural, substantive due process rights that are incorporated into our disciplinary process.
This is very bad for a lawyer to say, but let's put the law aside because you have some trenching points that the mayor's going to have to deal with. But at its core,
well, we have dealt with them.
Well, but here's a voice that's saying, if you think about this, not one, or except one complaint about use of force resulted in discipline through the internal affairs process. Does that make you think that there is some valid argument for significant civilian involvement? Or is there a principle that says civilians should not have a meaningful role in disciplining police for misconduct?
Well, civilians do. If you want to take a look, a civilian oversight of the police department, if you look at the statute 4814-118, that is the statute that promulgates the creation and regulation of a municipal police department in the state of New Jersey. Now, under that, it says the authority of the chief of police, but it also has the appropriate authority. Now, the appropriate authority could be the mayor, the manager, it could be, or a full-time executive such as a public safety director. Now, it could be a committee.
The power to create the review board.
Well, we have, by ordinance, by the statute, you have to have an appropriate authority. We do have an appropriate authority. That's the police director. Now, could the city change that from instead of having a police director, have a committee to be the appropriate authority? But you do have a civilian oversight of the police department. That's the appropriate authority, and all municipalities in the state of New Jersey have to designate.
Okay, well, that's an argument that we're hearing from all sides. It hasn't worked, but does it hold legal water?
And I think what's important to remember here, and which was raised, under the mayor's proposal, which we're still waiting for a final version, the police director retains final disciplinary authority. The internal affairs department remains in place. What the municipality here is doing is setting some borders, some parameters to guide the work of the police department. And I think that's entirely consistent with state law and entirely consistent with the guidelines. You know, the arguments against civilian oversight, and by civilian oversight I mean external from the police department, have been made, They've been made by the New York Police Department, by the Philadelphia Police Department, Washington, Atlanta, Chicago, Seattle, LA. These are not new arguments,
None of them, by the way, as strong as what Mayor Baraka is proposing.
Well, we'll see what ends up in the final, but what Mayor Baraka has done is learned from what the experience is in these other departments, learned what's worked in the CCRBs and what hasn't, and is crafting a model that I think should be the new model for the country.
But given the fact that internal affairs will still exist and that there's a cultural response within some section of the police department against this kind of change, is there a chance that you'll put this mechanism in place, but it'll turn out to be toothless?
No, we're going to do whatever we need to do to make sure that we make sure that it has the kind of teeth that it needs to work and to gain the trust of the people in the community, because that's ultimately what we need. And the way the thing is being characterized as kind of anti-police and all these other things, I think that this is just an opportunity to destroy something that's really progressive and kind of help us reform some of these departments around the country. It's obvious that the kind of cultural and institutional biases that exist in police departments remain, and they can't correct it on their own, that it has to be corrected. And when you say it's systemic, it doesn't fall directly on individual police officers. There are hundreds of great police officers throughout the country who come to work and do their job every single day. But there's some problems systemically, the kind of cultural and institutional problems and biases that exist in almost every major institution in America that seeks to promulgate this kind of oppressive force over folks that are in the community, and that's exactly what's happening. And whether you characterize it through race or class or geography, it exists. And we need another body to help correct that or move it in the right direction. And I think that this is the way to do that. I mean, we put a group together in complete thought of the law, right? So we didn't do this outside of the law or in contravention to the law. We did this thinking about the law itself, how it exists, and how we begin to create stuff that can stand the muster of court or whatever challenges that we perceive may happen, that we anticipate, as a matter of fact. So
Captain Chrystal, let me go back to my first question to you, which was, do you anticipate legal action? First, stop what you say is not legal.
First, I would like to negotiate. Before you even get to that point, negotiations.
Are negotiations on tap?
Nobody's knocked on my door. We haven't had any meetings on this, because if you look at the laws with regarding the Public Employer-Employee Relations Act, Title 34, it says the proposition of new rules or the modification of existing rules, it says shall be negotiated with the majority representative prior to its implementation.
So, Mayor, how about that?
So actually, I went to the FOP and we've had public hearings, but we're also creating what's called a matrix of disciplinary action. That's the only real change that exists, and in that is the idea that the police officers union, the FOP, the SOA, sit down with the director, the chief, and some community input to begin to create a new matrix of discipline that's not arbitrary.
But Captain Chrystal's saying, the matrix aside, if I understand you, that the very nature of the Civilian Police Review Board is contrary to state law. Do I get that right?
It doesn't change policies and procedures of the police department per se. It doesn't.
But it doesn't leave the Internal Affairs Bureau in place as the one place where complaints are heard.
But I don't think the law suggests that we have to do that, though. That's the only place where complaints can be heard. I think the issue starts getting murky when you start talking about investigating and you start talking about subpoena. So we create opportunities for investigations to take place and subpoena also to take place. But I don't think that the law says that you cannot have another body review what's going on.
We're in our last 30 seconds, but I'm curious as to whether you see this as part of a national conversation involving Missouri, Los Angeles, Chicago, and other places that are talking about policing.
And Newark is
race.
not the first civilian police review board, by the way, right? So they're all over the country. So we're late to the table.
But their state laws might not be exactly as ours.
You have to follow the laws. The laws are quite clear here. 4814-181, it's very clear. 4814-118 is quite clear in regards.
Okay, we don't know what those numbers mean.
Harry's going to explode if he doesn't get a
The
chance.
CCRB is supplementing the Internal Affairs Department, not replacing it. And I think that's what's critical here. And as you look at the outpouring of support in Newark over the past few months as this mayor has advanced the plan, I think it's going to be clear that, unsolicited advice to the union is really to embrace the process and to help Newark move forward.
But we'd like to be part of the negotiations.
We should be.
With 30 seconds really left now, let me ask you all, is there going to be a Civilian Police Review Board, and will it withstand scrutiny?
I don't know. I can't answer that right now. I'd have to look at the final draft of it.
Mayor?
There's absolutely going to be a Civilian Police Review Board in the city of Newark, and I think it'll stand the muster of the law. And we'll talk to the SOA and the FOP again.
All right.
Absolutely, and I think community partners have been waiting for this for 50 years and are thrilled that it's finally happening.
And we have to stop it there with my thanks to Mayor Baraka, Captain Chrystal, and Ari Rosmarin from the ACLU. But it's a story we'll be coming back to. It's what we do here on Due Process.
So we hope you'll join us next week and every week for more on the complex and the contentious in the world of law and justice. And let us know what you think. Join us on Facebook and on our website, where you'll also find our entire archive on demand. For Sandy, producer Tanya Bentley, and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Well, King said legislation can't change people's hearts, but it can prevent you from being lynched. So I would imagine that if we had a review board that was effective, that it begins to change people's behavior. And when you change people's behavior, you ultimately begins to change their mind. And I think that's important for us to begin to change the culture of what's happening in the police department. But also in that, it gives the community more faith in the police department itself, which is important for the community to actually believe in, depend on a police department. You know, you have really an occupied force in these communities all over America. You have a community and then you have an occupied force that's there in the community, as opposed to officers that are serving that community.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.